Thank you very much for uploading your podcast assignments. I must say it was very exciting to take a close listen to these students putting together a concerted dialogue about the range of topics. Most of you did something around Brexit, and it was inevitable that Brexit would come up because it is an ever-present way that we think about trade across borders, particularly here in Europe and in this class. So kudos to you for taking a stab at what is an ever growing and evolving subject. And I'll admit that you had to do all sorts of research and even track the historical and even look at what's going to be happening by the time you finish the first year of your university. We will be out of the EU. So kudos to you. Let me just start by saying that though it was a podcast and this format is new to all of us, you, of course, will not be graded on the technical issues that I will, of course, point out to you. They are meant as feedback in order to help you do better at this. After all, this is a teamwork activity, and it also is one meant to get you used to using a format of engaging in the workplace, i.e. digitally and through using digital formats to gather and produce information and exchange information in teams is one that you will be more commonly using in the workplace. And so this assignment was also meant to give you that opportunity. But as I said, I won't be grading you on the technical bits of the podcast. And let me just start there. I love music, and I clearly know that many of you do too. It's important to be crafty about how you use music. So, for example, you don't want to use music that distracts from or even drowns out some of the people who are meant to speak. And with that said, in some of your podcasts, it was difficult, in some cases, even impossible, to hear some of the contributions of some of your teammates. Did you listen to and edit them and also comment on them together? Because I certainly have to do that and looking at the grading rubric, but I also, again, would encourage you to do that both in your oral and written work. What got the highest grades, of course, was your ability to do these three things: describe, analyze, and discuss critically. Now, what does that mean? In the written format, as I said, and that's got to be a parallel for how we map out this podcast assignment, that meant those who were able to describe a particular scenario. So we're looking at an issue of business in Europe, and some of you are able to say, well, look at this company. This is what the context was, and this is what they did, and these were the ramifications. So those of you who were able to do that, those are what was marked highly. As a group assignment, this meant that not only those who were able to raise and research your different examples, is all of you did, most of you did. There's one group that unfortunately didn't do this particularly well. But those of you who did, it also meant that you were able to go to the next stage, analyze. So comment on the examples that team members had mentioned and actually take them to the next stage. Now, what got you really high scores were those of you who were able to facilitate this. So there are a couple of groups in particular where there were clearly individuals who were assigned to be facilitators. I remember Musakola and Hamid in their group's assignment, for example. They said that we have some questions to introduce everyone into the subject that we're talking about. They also had questions to advance the discussion forward. They also posed questions of one another about the examples and asked to compare and contrast. And that's, after all, what we're doing in an analytical stage is we're comparing and contrasting the different examples that we raise forward. And again, comparing and contrasting them to the theory that we also describe. And this is something that Moses, for example, did towards the end, unfortunately, in his group. I wish he had done it a bit earlier, was talk about the stakeholder framework and how do we then more systematically go through who are the stakeholders who are involved in the examples that are raised and how are they differently impacted by the decisions that are made in those examples. So this is, again, an area where those who did really well, they had an advantage. Again, I mentioned Moses' group because they raised this, and subsequently they were able to talk this through throughout Hamid's group as well. They raised several sorts of frameworks to help us unpack what these examples could mean for the next coming years, and certainly in post-Brexit planning, both from the perspective of consumers, but also from the perspective of um, the businesses. And this is where Wisdom's group had a particularly strong advantage. And I mentioned Wisdom and his group in particular because when this question of theory, of an analytical framework was raised, this is where we go from describing what an analytical framework is, or just posing the question, to using it to compare and contrast the different examples, but then to advance to the stage of criticality, and that is to say, okay, so how does it specifically apply then to this business, and how might that use that to plan in the future? So how can we look at the micro and the macro environment in the next 3 to 5 years? And this is where Wisdom was able to say, okay, so these stakeholders here, this part of the supply chain, they'll have this impact. You know, consumers are here, retailers are here, manufacturers are here, transport is here, and what will all this mean when we have or don't have a post-Brexit deal? Now, there is a group that I also want to say, I don't want to just say everyone did extremely well. There's another aspect of this that added a great deal of flavor. That is having a clear introduction, clear progression. As I said, there are several groups that had facilitators to move things along, or co-facilitators to move the subject along and give the listener clear guidance about where you're going. Again, just as you do with subheadings in a paper, and mention how the different parts of the discussion fit together. But equally, they had a summary at the end. They said how they came together and they summarized what were some of the significant ideas and milestones in the discussion, or even what different people contributed and what that ultimately meant for the topic. As you were asked to do in your self-assessment form, you were also asked to demonstrate the references that you use to inform your discussion. This is where I would say every group pretty much didn't do well, because you need to add the bit of credibility that comes to speaking about your sources. Who do you use to inform what you do? This says that you're not only well read, but it also demonstrates that you understand the scope of the topic. One group in particular seemed to just talk about a subject. They didn't have any particular examples. They had several impressions, and like many groups, they tried to bring in their trip experiences. They didn't do that so well because they didn't bring it back to, as other groups did, what does it have to do with the micro business example, and how can they relate their personal impressions to what's going on in the business environment? Thank you very much. This is an exciting opportunity for you to get to know how to do a presentation. I look forward to assignment number 2, where you get to do a very clear self-assessment of you as a potential leader within the European business environment. Bye.